I'm Rosemary Wang. As Freddie pointed out, I'm a DevOps person. I put that in quotes. But today I wanted to talk about something different. DevOps. And most of the time when people trend DevOps, it tends to be something about automation gone awry, and then they have to go back and fix it. But I actually wanted to talk about something different today, and I wanted to actually rethink about what DevOps means. So I wanted to focus on 10 ops things you might have forgotten while developing. Now you're probably looking at me and telling me, well, why do I care? And also, what, 10 ops things you forgot while developing? And that's because I tend to be a developer amongst operators and an operator amongst developers. So I see both perspectives very frequently. I'm a platform and infrastructure consultant. So basically, I like to talk about data centers, networking, anything about infrastructure, container orchestrators, you name it, I'd love to hear about it, and I hack a lot of them together. If you are interested in learning more, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. That's my Twitter handle, just remember it. And if you want to learn more about what I'm doing at the moment, I have a Medium blog as well with the same handle. So this talk actually started with a story. I rolled onto a project, and people were throwing confetti, having pizza parties. It was awesome. Pizza here. And they were talking about how they built an app and a platform. In this case, it was both, because both of them had to support each other. To me, they look the same. It doesn't matter if you tell me it's an app or a platform. The same practices should apply to both. So there was this really big celebration, but then they stopped for a second, and they asked me this big question. How do we support it? Which seems to be a simple question. Why not contact operations if you've got an external operations organization? But the reality is that it wasn't really quite that easy. It turns out it was 3 weeks before release, and they said, we don't have time to train ops. So they brought me in and said, train these guys in 3 weeks. No, if you've ever tried to train someone in a platform, very complicated platform in 3 weeks, that just doesn't happen. And even if you have an organization that has DevOps people embedded in your development teams, there's still a struggle to transfer that knowledge. And that's the oops in DevOps, because we totally and utterly forgot what it meant to include operations. So the question that I got after the fact was, as a developer, how can I help operations succeed? It doesn't seem to make any sense that there aren't really any ways for me to contribute back to operations. And my point was that, well, it doesn't happen all the way over here 3 weeks before release. I'm sorry, but like I said, there are a lot of questions, open-ended answers that you leave open when you do something 3 weeks before release. Things like, where's the standard operating procedure, or SOP? What do we even alert on? How do we update configuration? We left it all open. Your security people are probably really upset about that. And where do all the logs go? Because for some reason, we can't actually figure out what happened. So this does not mean operation success. Let's face it. Doing all this at last minute is quite dangerous, as me hitting record there, but also it's really annoying and it's anxiety-ridden, and a lot of us just don't want to do it when we have a lot of features that we can develop. What if we actually thought about it at the beginning, though? When we actually started talking about what we wanted to develop and who we wanted to develop with? What if we engaged operations early in the process? That gives your operations organization time to get the capacity they need, to get the engineers who are able to take on the platform that you want, to actually think about where the standard operating procedure is located at, what you want to alert on, how do you update your configurations. Your security team is going to be really happy because everything is secure, you designed it that way, and you know where the logs are located at. So today, I wanted to go through this story of the 10 things that I hope you remember while developing. And these 10 ops things will help you ensure operation success. So the first thing that I wanted to outline was defining metrics for your operations organization. And it seems pretty easy to do this after the fact, right? But the problem is, how do you measure improvement? You can't measure improvement at the end when you actually have never gotten a baseline in the beginning. The idea is define the metrics you want, because estimations gain accuracy over time. Now, don't abuse this. If you say, I want to be a unicorn tech giant and deploy thousands of times a day, that's not going to help you in this particular situation. But actually, start defining the metrics that matter to your ops organization. So there are some typical called DevOps metrics on here. Availability, change lead time, change failure rate, mean time to recovery, and deployment frequency. And there's a random one at the bottom, cost. I'll go into that a little later. Don't worry. I know we're all tech people and we don't want to think about cost, but there's going to be something about that. All of these metrics are really well defined in DevOps handbooks, so I'm not going to go through them too much, but I will pick up two of them that I hope that you take away as something important, or at least something to think about. Change failure rate. If your change failure rate is high, people don't have confidence in making changes. That's what happens because they're worried it's going to fail. And this is particularly something I witnessed in network engineering in particular. I'm a networking nerd. Sorry, everybody. But I really like working with network engineers. And they're notorious for making changes that break things. Because the failure rate is so high, they have no confidence in doing anything to improve it. They don't even want to automate because they're worried that's going to break something too. So what do? Well, if you think about how you measure change failure rate in the beginning, you improve over time, and you approach with a mentality of improvement, your ops people are going to gain confidence by the time you release. So there's one example of how you can take a metric, define it, and help your operations team define success. Another is deployment frequency. And like I said, this is pretty abused. A lot of people say, I want to deploy thousands of times a day. But do you have 1,000 people who can rotate on call to support your deployment of 1,000 times a day if that's your operating procedure? The reality is maybe not. And if you're in a pure CI/CD or you're very advanced, you're very mature in that CD model, then maybe it doesn't matter. But if you're not, don't ask to deploy thousands of times a day if you don't have the capacity to do it. And finally, cost. So I have a little bit of a story on this one. When I actually started working on public cloud stuff, it never occurred to me that the operating expense of the public cloud could actually skyrocket. So I was just deploying instances because it was cool, because I could get them in 5 minutes. I was really excited. But then I got my cloud bill. And I had to throw in a gadget, because, what's not a tech talk without a gadget? But that was my expression. That's my cloud bill. It was very unpleasant. So then I went through and I started deleting instances, but then I didn't know which instances I needed and which instances I didn't need. And then I remembered, this is exactly what happens in your operations organization. Your CFO, CTO, CIO, manager looks at the bill, says, no, we can't have this many instances, start removing them. Tells your operations team, start to remove them. And then they remove things they're not supposed to. Or they remove things that you didn't even know existed in the first place, right? So why does this matter? Well, cost and then the remediation of cost actually creates toil. It's another thing for your operations team to do. It's another thing for them to think about, and it's not something that they think about when trying to support your application or your platform. So defining the metrics not only eliminates toil so that you actually estimate your capacity properly, but also it sets on-call expectations. Who in here has been told to be on call for a weekend about 12 hours before they've had to actually be on call? Yeah, it's not a fun feeling. No one likes doing that. So if you set the on-call expectations early, people are going to be more amenable to that, and they're not going to have complete mutiny. So besides defining your metrics, show your metrics, because visible improvement requires visibility. If you don't actually know what you're measuring, and you also can't see what you're measuring, you also can't measure improvement. So write stories to create dashboards early. Dashboards are really straightforward. Sometimes you can just put on metrics that I mentioned in number 1, and they show how you're doing. The idea is that everybody on the team can go and take a look. What's your lead deployment time? What's your change failure rate? What are all these metrics? Are we really improving? But then there are some other metrics you can think about. Your app or platform behavior. This is something to catch early on. If you don't catch your app or platform performance early on, you will find yourself scrambling also 4 weeks before release trying to optimize. So what do I mean by app or platform behavior? Well, there are a lot of application side metrics you can monitor. Request rates, circuit breaking behavior, retries, and response time are some of them. If you dashboard these really early on, you can gauge what you're doing, how your application is performing. And you can actually think about writing stories to improve it over time. So you're building stability, building consistency into your platform from the very beginning. From a platform perspective, you also have a few others. Health checking, disk, CPU bandwidth usage, pretty typical. And then machine machine lifecycle details. So this might seem more of an audit requirement, but it actually was one of the downfalls of my early operations career, which wasn't that long ago. But when I actually got my first operations task, it was to remediate a bunch of servers that had a Linux vulnerability. And I remember the CIO walking to my desk. It was a very flat hierarchy at the time. Walking to my desk, he says, "So, how many servers are impacted by this Linux security vulnerability?" And I was mortified because I couldn't actually give him a number. So I was like, "I will track that down for you." And in like true gusto, I went to the guys who managed inventory. I went to the guys who managed financials. I just went everywhere. And finally, I got a spreadsheet with the kernels for some reason from this financial officer. I'm not really sure how that happened. But the point is that it was a spreadsheet. And I vowed, because it took me 3 days to track down this spreadsheet, that I wanted to make it easier. Because if someone asked me later on how many Linux machines are affected by this vulnerability, I'd be able to answer. So I created a dashboard for it because I got tired of a ton of people. So actually, when you think about it, try dashboarding early because you get those indicators. It actually gives you speed in the long run. Not necessarily in the short run, but in the long run. If you want to know more about metrics and monitoring and you love them to pieces, the SRE book is online. Go ahead and take a look. They have some information. My favorite is Practical Monitoring. It's a more recent publication by Mike Julian. Very practical indeed. That's the title. The Art of Monitoring is also pretty good too. And if you are interested in any of these resources, I will put the slides on Meetup, and you will be able to actually link to everything in the slides. So the third thing to think about to ensure operation success early on, design for resource limits. Abstractions are infinite, but systems are finite and nuanced. It sounds like a demotivator's calendar, if anybody's ever seen a demotivator's calendar, but it's true, right? We think about development as something that's infinite on our laptops, which is why we say it works locally, but it didn't work on the cloud. I heard that a lot. So what exactly do I mean by resource limits? Well, disk space for logs, for one thing. Your disk space for logs fills up really quickly in production, and then you don't really think about rotation or forwarding or doing anything with them. And the answer is not to extend the partition. I've done that multiple times. Not the right answer, because you're just going to hit that limit again. So implement rotation and forwarding early, because it's actually fairly nuanced. If anybody's tried to do log rotate in one go, sometimes it doesn't quite work out the way you think they will. And also log forwarding drivers can be difficult to implement at times if they're not performant. So find these things out early, otherwise you might find yourself in a jam. Timeouts are another important one. Expiration dates. How many have had a certificate expire on them before? Yeah. So it's really frustrating because you don't know sometimes that it expired. So set alerts on them, please. It actually saves everybody's lives. System and container limits are a pretty obvious one, right? System limits are pretty well defined, but I actually wanted to go through one particular container limit that very few people might know about. Actually, maybe some people here know about. So this is something I see in production a lot. Who knows about the killer for Java apps? Okay, good crowd. Okay. So for those who haven't heard of this lovely phenomena called killer, it actually targets containerized Java apps. And it maybe doesn't target it per se, but the way that the Java apps work make it more amenable to killer in this particular way. So let's think about this scenario for a second. I'm on my laptop. Great, everything's fine. Docker run. I spin up my container, and everything seems infinite. It's fantastic. I can do whatever I want to. I put my container in there. I don't care how much memory I've consumed. Everything is awesome. And then I put it on the cloud. And I have to pass a limit. So in this case, maybe I'm putting in a 0.5 gig limit on my container. Well, your container engine tends to allocate, by default, an equivalent amount of swap space. I won't go into swap space too much, Linux internals, but in total, your operating system allows that container 1 gig of memory. All right, let's do the math. 1 gig, VM 8 gigs, 1/8. Great. Your container gets 1/8 of the VM. But what's in the container? Anybody want to take a guess?
Java.
Someone said something.
Java.
Java is in the container. And what is Java? Well, it's another container. So the JVM in itself is a container, and JVM has no awareness of what the container is doing, right? So JVM's like, oh, this is great. I'm here, and I can take 1/4 of of the VM's memory. It doesn't actually know that the container only has an eighth of the memory. It has a fourth because of ergonomic sizing, because someone didn't set their heap sizes. So by default, if you don't set your heap size, it will just ergonomically size to whatever your VM machine is. And the result, unkill. Your operating system does not like this. It thinks that it had an eighth for a process, but then JVM exceeded it, so now it's going to kill it. Believe it or not, I see this in production a lot, which is a little funny, because there's a really simple solution, which is to set your Java heap size. There's an XMX parameter that you can set when you start your Java application. Set it. I know nobody wants to set it fixed, but it's better to do it earlier rather than later, so that you don't have to go back and then remediate all your applications to do it. So now you know, the unkiller. Don't let it target you. If you're interested in learning more, Red Hat has a blog on it. A lot of people have blogged on this before, so you can go through this. It talks more about the internals if you want to experiment for yourself as well. So besides resource limits, what are some other things you can do? Well, early on, write actionable log messages. Log messages are only useful if an operator doesn't need to call you. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about log messages not just being actionable, but structurable as well, by doing an example. And when I talk about structurable, I hope your log messages are structured, because that's, I guess, the technical term, but I say structurable because you may or may not want them to be forwarded. But if you do, or by general rule of thumb, just try structuring them. Give them the ability to be structured and fed to something else. I'll go into that a little later, but let's go through an example. A couple months ago, I was pairing with Dev, and we were running an open source tool. We ran it the first time. This came out. Does anyone want to hazard a guess what this is?
Empty variable.
Empty variable, exactly. So we thought maybe it was a bug within the open source code. We don't know what's going on. So we said, okay, well, this isn't good. So we called the dev that had been working on this for 2 months. And we asked him, hey, have you seen this before? No, I've never seen it before. I don't know what it is. So we spent 2 hours debugging. And lo and behold, the root cause had nothing to do with the program at all. It had everything to do with the fact that we never defined an input variable that it required. And apparently that's the error message that you get if you don't define an input variable. Wasted 2 hours of my time. Very upset. So honestly, if you take a look at this log message now, it's structurable because you can now take this and structure it into anything you want to, like parsing. But it's also actionable. It tells me very explicitly there's an error in the configuration and the host should be defined as an input variable. Might save you 2 hours. So think about how you write your log messages, because you never know how much time it will save you. And it will save your operator from going through and looking at different things. So if you're actually thinking about structuring your logs, just as a side note, 12-factor is, has anybody not heard of 12-factor? Okay. So 12-factor, highly recommends you collate your logs and send them externally. This is so useful, especially in a container environment, and in any environment for that matter. So structuring your logs becomes really important, especially when you're planning to aggregate them this way. Now, if you don't like logs at all, never fear. There's an option now. And that's to log action, statistics, or aggregates. Now, this is becoming more and more popular, especially with more scale. And this is something like statsd. So if you're doing something like a database write, and you want to know how many database writes came in place, you do statsd.increment, and that action tells you how many database writes failed in a certain period of time. So you go check it out. There are a couple of resources down here. Again, they'll be online, so you can take a look. Number 5. So there's more than just log messages to think about, actually. Configuration and metadata. Configuration and metadata is kind of like log messages, but I feel like it's a little bit separate too. I mean, really, you should try to strive to keep your configuration and metadata actionable and structured, just like log messages. But there's something else to configuration and metadata to think about. If your configuration is tribal knowledge, then anyone new must learn your ways. At one point, some dev actually joked to me, oh, you have to walk over coals to understand what we're doing in our configuration. Please don't have anybody walk over. That's just not nice. So, what do I mean by configuration should be standardized in language and location? 2 things. Language, location. That's because standardization really only comes within your team. Your team has to agree on the language of configuration, so what makes sense to them, and the location. where you find your golden standard. And I also have an example for this one. I work with a lot of devs, if you can't tell. And this was actually something that a dev brought to me the other day. And he goes, I'm deploying someone else's service and I don't know what's happening. It's dying, your platform's not working. And I looked at it and I was like, well, okay, back up. What did you do? So he explains to me that his service depends on this other service and he wants to deploy it. So he looks at the other service's Docker file and sees this expose 8080. Expose is a documentation variable in a Docker file. It's not actually anything that exposes. So for him, he said, okay, the golden standard, we all agree that we put in our Docker file which port it's serving on. It must be on 8080. Hold on. So I looked at the container orchestrator task definition to see what's going on. Because it's already in production. This app is in production, so maybe there's just something wrong. It was on port 3000. He had spent an hour and a half trying to figure out what happened. And I felt so bad. And honestly, if you think about it, keeping these matched, right, shouldn't be that hard. Write a linting program. Use something to figure out what's going on in your Docker file and make sure people adhere to those standards. If everyone on the team who develops this service knows that expose is on 3000, and they just run it through a pipeline, the pipeline says, no, you put 8080 here instead of 3000, then you would have caught this early on. And the poor other developer who needed this service upstream would not have spent an hour and a half trying to dig through a Docker file and subsequent platforms. So keep in mind, language and location makes a really big difference. Metadata and tagging should be clear in its function. Metadata, I typically reference to tagging because in platform space, metadata and tagging is just this big unknown. So people want to tag their instances for auditing, they want to tag it for who knows what, right? How many of you have this tag in your machine somehow? Okay, we've got 1, 2. Or how many of you have just a really abstract tag that just happens to be environment? Yeah, so a lot of people like to use environment is equal to staging. What they don't tell you though, and this is the big mistake I made once. Oops. Environment to staging means 4 or 5 other things that they never told you. So it meant like, oh no, don't alert on it. Just don't do it. Or yes, your performance team needs that tag to parse. Or yes, your monitoring team needs it in order for some upstream service to work. And audit really doesn't care about it. All of these things are embedded in a tag. How are you supposed to know that all of these things are in this tag? Well, you don't. Unless you actually have a lot of wikis, which that gets lost in the ether. So what do, right? You tag more clearly. So if you know that this instance is something that's in staging, you're clear that logging is true, alerts are false. These are things that your operator understands. These are things that even a new developer on your team understands. So try to make it clearer in function. Makes it a lot easier and someone's not going to break something. The 6th thing, speaking of breaking things, troubleshooting. How do you fix things? I live by a rule of the sign of 3. Maybe it's not so hard and fast of a rule, but generally speaking, if it takes more than the sign of 3, I don't want to touch it, and I want to make it easier to troubleshoot. Very straightforward. So what's the sign of 3? 3 minutes to decipher the problem, 3 people to check dependencies, and 3 hops to get to information. If it takes more than these 3, and then the 3 and the 3, then it's too hard to troubleshoot. So a more tangible example is that at one point I had some system that had gone down and some user reported it to me. So that was my alert. So it took me a minute to acknowledge that something went down and ask the user, well, what happened? Then it took a minute to figure out which components because it wasn't clear. He just said it's not working. Well, what components? So then I took another minute to figure out what happened. And then it took another minute to determine impact, right? Well, I actually couldn't decide impact. It took more like 40 minutes to decide impact because I didn't know what other services depended on his service, right? So then checking dependencies. This was the next step. I was the primary operator, and I needed to find someone who had been making a network change that I didn't know about. But somehow or another, I found out that someone was making a network change. So I ran over there and I said, are you making a network change? And he goes, yeah, but it shouldn't have impacted. Come on. So then I go back to the developer. I'm like, what's going on? Can you just give me like a full bug report? What's good? About like, I would say an hour later, like 10 people got on a conference line. And then it escalated to 50. And then it escalated to 100. Who's been in that before? Yeah, the 100-person conference line. Oh no. 100 people to debug doesn't help you. than 3 hops. This frustrates me, right? It takes me 1 hop to get on the VPN, and I hate messing with tokens. And then it takes me another hop to get to the host of the app, so I have to SSH to it. But then to get to the app logs, I have to actually find them. They're not in var log. They're not in anywhere normal, so I have to find where they are. So then I have to call someone else and find where they are. Anyway, you get the drift right now. It's really difficult to troubleshoot when you have this many hoops to jump through. So adhere to the rule of 3. If you find yourself doing more of the time, you're just going to spend a lot of time trying to find the right people to talk to. So try to eliminate that when you're in development, right? Try to make your upstream services exposed in a health check. Number 7, we're almost there. Promise. Triage alerts. This seems a little counterintuitive, right? Because alerts should trigger a triage. But the point is that alert fatigue is real. I've had burnout before because of alert fatigue. So determine how alerts impact the operators. It's so easy as an operator to click snooze 4 times. So try to avoid snoozing. So what do I mean by triaging alerts? I'm a consultant now, so I have to put a matrix in here. Now I'm just going to talk about what's important versus urgent. This is an Eisenhower decision matrix. People cite it a lot in self-help, but actually I do this for alerts. If it's not important and not urgent, don't alert. That seems pretty straightforward. If it's urgent and not important, self-heal. This should be automated. You really don't care. If it's important and not urgent, drop it in chat. And if it's important and urgent, that's when you wake me up, please. And that's alert worthy. So if I give a more tangible example, if it's not important and not urgent, it might be something like database writes down during maintenance. Well, you know it's maintenance. Why would you alert me? And wake me up in the middle of the night. I don't want that. So don't alert on that. Not important and urgent, one database node is down. If you've got your HA configuration turned on, this should not matter. I mean, you might want to remediate it automatically after the fact, but it shouldn't really matter. So don't alert on it. If it's important and not urgent, your database disk usage may triple. That might cause an outage depending on where your disk space is, etc. You never really know. So drop it in chat to investigate, especially because you never know. It might be something you need to do strategically, or something that has a much larger story that you need to play in order for it to work. Then you've got important and urgent. Database outage, financial consequences, wake me up. That's pretty obvious, right? If it has financial consequences, I want to know about it. Someone has to wake me up. That's alert worthy. Speaking of alerts and content, alert context matters. Applications database is down. This isn't really helpful, right? I mean, applications have databases, right? That's what happens. So actually, if you add something like a runbook or a knowledge base article, you can now tell your operator which database, which table, what's in it, how do I fix it. All of these things, you put it in the alert so they know exactly what to do. Important to think about, especially because sometimes your operators will change. So it's good to know what they can do and what they can't do. Number 8, pipelines as code. Speaking of Tech Radar, this was in Tech Radar last year. I haven't read the new Tech Radar, so I don't know if it's in there this year. But who has heard of pipeline as code? Okay. All right, so pipeline. Has anybody worked with pipelines before? Yes. Okay, so sometimes pipelines can be really time-consuming and really painful. Manual creation especially can be time-consuming because you have to drag and you have to drop and then you have to type in the Git repository. It's just 5 steps and more and more and more. So start to script pipelines like app deployments. The idea is that you should be able to deploy pipelines just as you deploy apps. Kind of meta because your pipelines deploy your apps, but anyway, we're going to bypass that a little bit. So if you are actually doing a pipeline, you might have 6 stages, and this was the case very recently for a platform. We had a linting stage to check our standards, okay? Test to make sure the platform's testable and it's available. Secures the platform, ensures that we're not leaking something. Monitor actually checks to make sure our monitoring configuration is good. Perform actually is a performance step, it actually does some testing. And then there's a deployment step. So 6 steps. I brought this to my operator. Said, "Hi, can you deploy this in Jenkins for me?" And she goes, "What?" And she looks at it, and she nearly cried. Granted, she had been pulling 16-hour shifts, so I couldn't blame her, right? But to create 6 pipelines manually with pretty complex configuration, she just was like, "I'm intimidated. I don't know what to do." So I actually approached it a little bit more Jenkins specific. So if any of you are using any of the other CI frameworks, good. So Jenkins more recently has gotten better about this as pipeline as code. They have new pipeline plugins. Use the declarative pipeline syntax so you don't have to click, drag, and drop parameters because that's annoying. Input steps, stop, execution, and maybe reference to someone else. So that's a great way to at least tell an operator, can you go check with someone, make sure they sign off. And C jobs. I'll talk a little bit about C jobs because generally speaking, you should try to do this for any CI framework that you work on. But C jobs are jobs that create other jobs, right? So you use one script, which is this Groovy script in Jenkins, c.groovy. You use the Jenkins job DSL plugin, it will accomplish this for you. But it's a Groovy script here, or any other script you want, that actually allows you to script the creation of pipelines. So here I've got a pipeline job, I've got its definition, I know the gate URL, I know the credentials branch, and I know exactly what the Jenkins file is. The idea is that you take this one C job and you blow it out to 6, so it creates it all for you. So the operator, instead of spending 2 hours creating 6 jobs across 3 different Jenkins instances across 3 different environments, spend probably about 5 minutes, actually. So it's pretty helpful. I highly recommend you do this early, if just for yourself, if you're playing around with a CI framework. Write a C job. Number 9, second to last bit. And probably the one people harp on the most, but never really fully address. We all dream of least privilege access. That's great. I dream of least privilege access, even in my sleep, which says a lot. But we always start with all privilege access. In the heat of development, we forget to secure stuff. Plain and simple. And sometimes it's disruptive. But here's the problem. If you do security with any of these things, you can't implement them easily post-case. You have to go through a lot of refactoring just to make it work. Certificates are one. Checking network access. I'm sorry, I'm apologizing on behalf of all network engineers out there. It takes a long time to configure routing. It takes a long time to configure firewalls. But if you put the request in early, you can do it more quickly. Change your default passwords and usernames. It's so easy just to use the default. But what happens when there's a security breach? Beyond just changing the defaults, think about how you rotate them. What's the process for changing them? That's pretty important too. Designing for tokens and ACLs is something more specific to console and vault, but as more people are using console and vault, I see this abused the most. If you're using console, try to lock it down with ACLs. They have them available. It's not necessarily full security, but at least you're stopping people from configuring things in console that they're not supposed to configure. On top of that, tokens for vault. If you're using the root token for vault, that's not using vault, okay? Root token has everything access, so generally speaking, don't use the root token. Design for token access. Think about that, embed that. And finally, access policies. Who's heard of the S3 bucket violations in the news lately? From very different companies, yes. So S3 buckets didn't have the right policies because policies are hard to write. If anybody's ever tried to write an S3 bucket policy and knows it off the top of their head, good on you. Good on you. I certainly cannot do that. So, access policies, secure them, actually take time to investigate what you need out of an access policy. Because I guarantee you what you think is right is not actually correct at all. And my pet peeve is this. Can anybody tell me what this means? It says all TCP from 000/0 to 000/0, and then the last rule is deny all. Does anybody know what this actually says or does? Well,
all traffic.
Yes, all traffic. Basically, you have a deny-all policy. You've assumed a whitelist policy, effectively. But some reason your whitelist policy, or the one whitelist rule you have, allows all TCP traffic from everything to everything. This is something that people violate in security groups, software-defined networking, sometimes container networking, sometimes IP-tables. So what do? Well, your security team looks at it, scans it, and freaks out. They're like, why? You're opening everything to everything. Anything can get in. So they tell you to close the ports. It broke something. You don't really know what it broke. So you sit there trying to figure out which port you accidentally closed because you didn't really know that your app was using a port, right? Well, there's an easy way to solve this. Design for the ports from the beginning. Test it from the beginning. Think about it from the beginning. Components like console have neat little documents that tell you exactly which port to use, why it's used, and the protocol. So once you secure the least privilege access, you don't have to think about it after that because you know it works. You've tested it. Your operations team doesn't go back, close the ports on you, and you say, no, something stopped working. And if you don't know, a little bit of Linux sometimes helps. Netstat or LSOF, grab on the PID. The idea is you can get that information while it's running on the box. But do it early because you need time to do this. Security is hard. And the last one, the one that I get asked the most often. How do I teach my operations team? Tacit knowledge is a funny thing. If I tell you how to ride a bicycle, I don't think you fully know how to ride a bicycle unless you got on the bicycle yourself and tried to ride the bicycle, right? So we'll only gain the technical expertise if we do it ourselves, and that's so true in development and operations especially. So how do you gain tacit knowledge? And how do you build that with your operations team very early? Well, people like to suggest rotations in development testing and operations. If you get operations buy-in early enough, they'll inject people into development and testing. I think operations and testing works really well because what do QAs do? They like breaking things. What do ops do? Fix things. So it's a great relationship. But they also have dev and operations rotations as well. And the idea is that once your devs see a lot, they'll start to fix things. So do those rotations, but sometimes it's not possible, even if you try to get buy-in really early on. So what do? How many of you have heard of chaos engineering or chaos monkey or some variant of the sort? Yes, okay. So chaos monkey, it is a Netflix tool that kills VMs or processes. Near and dear to my heart. But the thing is that not everybody has the risk appetite to do chaos monkey because honestly, we're all not Netflix. But hey, we're gonna try. So I do a variant. This is me naming it. It's probably not perfectly representative, but I call it Chaos Pygmy Marmoset because Pygmy Marmosets are really cute and really tiny, and they're kind of mischievous, but they don't really do too much. You don't have to worry about them. So what is a Chaos Pygmy Marmoset? It's time-boxed exercises of known problems. There are problems that I've seen in dev or while I'm doing stuff, and I know that might be something that crops up later. So I actually set those aside. I copy and paste the things I do, and I put them in a document, and I make them evil time box exercises for operations. So I gather them all in or at least a subset of them who have some time. And I talk about, all right, here's an exercise, something went wrong, fix it. And they all work together as a group to figure out what happened. And sometimes I give them hints along the way. This serves a lot of purposes. It tests your alerts. So you know if you break something or you destroy something, it fires an alert and your operations team should respond. If it's a good alert, they'll respond the right way. If it's not so good, you need to go back to the drawing board. It also gives hands-on practice, which is important. You have a measurable mean time to resolution. The idea is that if you time-boxed this kind of problem to an hour, you know that a similar kind of problem might take about an hour. Now, you can't cover everything under Chaos Pygmy Marmoset. Sorry. But the idea is that you give them hands-on practice early. And finally, it helps you promote ops, like apps. The idea is that you can move from dev to prod only if it's operationally ready, and if your operations team is ready to do it. So these are the 10 in summary. I'll pause, so if anybody wants to take a picture, you can take a picture. But when I look at all of these things, these are the 10 things that I hope you remember, ops things that I hope you remember while developing. It occurred to me, there's actually a couple takeaways from this. There we go. All right, everybody good? The slides will be up later, so. Takeaways. Treat ops as a user. Ops might not be your traditional user, but they're a user nevertheless of your platform, of your development. Take pride in that. Treat the ops journey like any other user journey that you have. Design for ops experience, because we all have to do ops for our own applications or platforms at the end of the day. Who hasn't debugged their own platform? Rhetorical question. I don't know the answer. But who hasn't debugged their own platform? So optimize for that ops experience early. That way, you can take DevOps, the 10 ops things you might have forgotten while developing, and change it to DevOps. Real DevOps. Right? 10 ops things you don't have to think about at all when releasing. Thanks. And all good work with questions. Any questions?
Really?
All right. Questions? I don't know if that's a, we got one.
For configuration data, like, do you have a preferred format, like JSON, YAML, or anything else?
JSON. Definitely JSON. Although I know a lot of people prefer YAML in certain ways because there's readability, but JSON makes it a lot easier for larger configurations, especially.
So I got one question. So like most of the logs that I have to like look through aren't written by the developers. They're written by like the tools that the developers want to use. So sometimes we have to test stuff, and they're like, let's just put the to debug level so I can see more information, so I can see like how to flow better. But then, that's like 5 gigs every 10 minutes of logs. I don't know. How do you make that kind of?
Yeah, it's unfortunately for better or for worse, an optimization decision you have to make.
Right.
If you've got systems that are capable, and you're log forwarding them anyway, right. Hopefully your log forwarder is performant enough. That's why you test early on, because they do get really big, especially when you turn on debugging. So there are probably better mechanisms now to get that volume of logs and parse them. If you're using a public cloud or some other vendor holding those logs in another way, you might have to go look and see and talk to the vendor for some customization if that's the case.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
I appreciated your suggestion about thinking about alerts early on in the development process, and also alert fatigue. I guess it seems like it's very hard often to get alerts right until it's in production. I wonder if you have any suggestions about alerting, best practices, things you've learned along the way.
Yeah, so chaos picking marmoset is probably my easiest way to gauge if an alert is right or not, because I'll break something that's very intentional for the alert itself, and usually an operator will respond to that, and how they respond is going to help me understand if that alert is effective or not. Unfortunately, there's some great resources from a lot of the data analytics guys, Datadog, etc., about best practices on what metrics to alert on. And that actually helps a lot to learn. I think with a crash course of 3 weeks in alerting at one point, the easiest thing that I found was just looking at the best practices metrics, and those generally cover what you're looking for, unless there's an edge case.
And how exactly does a chaos pygmy marmoset look? Is that you sitting down with a desk and can you talk that?
Yeah, sure. Of course. So usually I set aside some time. I talk to the ops manager. I say, can I get an hour or 2 hours of your time? And they'll usually allocate someone who's not on call. They'll have 2 or 3 people who are not on rotation. And the way I sell it is you need to ensure that you have a lower mean time to recovery, and you want to give your ops team practice. So they'll actually sit on a conference bridge if they're remote, or I'll try to get them in person, and we'll actually sit side by side. I'll break something, and they'll get the alert. The idea is that the team itself has to debug what's going on. And if I see them going in sort of a different direction, then I'll try to guide them and hint them back. The idea is that I'm keeping it to an hour or 2 hours, so I understand how much they're actually doing in a certain period of time. And then over time, we just iterate. We do it once a week or something with some new feature that we've developed, and they'll kill it, bring it back up.
Got one more question.
Sure.
So what's your top 3 of monitoring system that does good dashboarding for you?
Depends. I like Prometheus. Yeah. Well, I like Prometheus fed to Grafana. So Grafana, I think, is just generally the one that I've always seen and I've always used. I can't say I've used any other good dashboards. Does anybody have any good dashboarding tools that they recall off the top of their head or they prefer using? Yeah, I guess I like Grafana because of the flexibility, but I also like using Prometheus, and that feeds to it really well. So I guess it depends on your own personal preference. I know quite a few people also like using Splunk Dashboards as well to a certain degree for some bits and pieces of things. So it depends on the customization.
AWS has dashboards built into. I don't know. A lot of people don't even know about that.
Yeah, exactly. In CloudWatch, you can set dashboards. Really helpful if you're not planning on pulling CloudTrail or anything else out to somewhere else.
So how do you, the chaos thing, how do you actually break it?
I go in and I break it. It's usually not in production. I try to get as close to production environment as possible. So I'll go in, I'll break it, I'll give them an opportunity. I try to talk to the monitoring team to convince them to set monitoring in a dev environment so they can at least mock the alerts. But it kind of depends on the circumstance, but I like doing it as close to dev as possible, as close to production as possible.
Would it be something like taking down a server, putting in a weird firewall rule or something like that?
Yeah, I've done that too. I've injected IP table rules. That one was a tricky one. That took about 3 hours. But they were really enthusiastic about it. And it's great because it's a lot of confidence building and team bonding as well.
If you're using environment configuration, like we could use like Mocky, like do mocks dependency services with like 500 errors. That's really good too. So you can also test your case.
Mocky?
Yeah, Mocky is pretty cool.
All right. Any other questions? You can catch me after. Resource list, I'll post that up as well.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Just a quick reminder, we have the Tech Radar talk on next Tuesday, December the 5th. Please come, it's going to be very exciting. So I hope you'll learn something today. We're actually going to have an end-of-year poll, so you'll find that if you're subscribed to the meetup. So please respond to that. That will have a lot of help for us to deciding what kind of talks we want next year. Whether it's things like this or serverless or IoT or more ops stuff. But please give us some feedback. So maybe another round of applause for our speaker tonight.